Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Free Market Foundation vlog here with me, Chris Hattingh, project manager here at the FMF. Thank you all for joining me once again. I hope you're all doing well, that you've had a good week thus far. For those of you who are worried about the future prospects of yourself and your family and the future prospects of South Africa in general, I want you to calm down, not be alarmed anymore, as the president has appointed a new economic advisory panel, council, take your pick, whatever you want to call it, to advise him on the economic situation in the country and the plans and reforms that South Africa needs to implement. Now, while I'm sure that there are a few people with good intentions on the panel, and I think there are people there whom I think highly of and their ideas, I don't think the panel is going to produce the reforms and changes that South Africa needs. And why do I say this? Well, because everyone on the panel, most of, if not all, including the president and his own team in government, they all believe in the central role of the government, that the government is needed to kickstart economic growth, economic recovery, economic change. They don't see the individual as primary, they see the state as primary. And I think for as long as we have that sort of philosophy, that concept being the predominant one in government, we won't see any real change, unfortunately. It doesn't matter whom is appointed or whom the president talks to. None of these, it doesn't matter about the personalities, it matters, the ideas matter the most, I think. And at the moment, unfortunately, South Africa is following the wrong ideas. We're following the ideas of socialism, of statism, of state control, of less economic freedom, and therefore we're seeing less economic growth. Now, for those on the panel, and I'm hoping that they're open to lots of discussion about this, that they're willing to listen to different avenues, no matter how radical or hush-hush neoliberal these ideas might sound. I know none of us, all of us are too scared to use the N-word nowadays. There is a document which they could look to, and which I would advise and recommend all of you look at and read for your own interest, if you are interested in what changes South Africa could actually implement to turn things around. And these ideas are contained in the Economic Freedom of the World report, the EFW, which is produced by the Fraser Institute from Canada. They're a partner of the Free Market Foundation. And on that note, I'd also like to thank the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung for their work and help with the FMF in helping us to promote the EFW as well. So both Fraser and the FNS are great partners of the Free Market Foundation, and we greatly appreciate working with them every year. Now, the EFW is based on data collated from various sources such as the World Bank and the IMF, and then the Fraser Institute produces this index where they rank 162 countries around the world based on 5 areas. I don't think I held up my hand properly. 5 areas regarding economic freedom, and then they rank the countries based on their sort of how they perform in each sector. Now, just to give you a sort of broad overview of the EFW, those 5 areas are size of government, legal structure and security of property rights, access to sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and finally regulation of credit, labor and business. In the last 5 years, South Africa's largest falls are compliance cost of importing and exporting, down from 7.5 to 4.7, extra payments and bribes from 7.5 to 2.8, so a really big drop there, and protection of property rights from 7.7 to 5.4. Now, of those 5 areas that I mentioned, if you associate South Africa with any of those concepts, I applaud your mental gymnastics, because I don't think any of us who have been reading the news and keeping track of the awful economic data that comes out of South Africa almost every single day, associates South Africa with things such as sound money, proper protection of property rights, or any of the others. We're going in the direction of the opposite of those concepts. We're almost undermining any notion of economic freedom that we have had in South Africa, and we're seeing the results of that with over 10 million people unemployed. Just as one example, we're seeing more and more investment and investors leaving the country, not coming to South Africa, but leaving. And indeed, many South Africans are looking at emigrating from South Africa because they simply cannot build their futures in the country. A large part of that is due to the expropriation without compensation discussion. It seems that the government is going ahead with that, and it simply comes down to the fact that you cannot build anything, a business or a family, to put it that way, in a country where your property is up for seizure at any point. And this applies across the board. Once you dilute property rights, you dilute human rights. I think property rights underpin all human rights, and it's for all South Africans of all creeds, religions, colors, anything. Take your pick. Once you remove property rights, the concept of individual property rights, and once you trample on it, you're going down a path of proper tyranny and oppression. It's sad that coming from our history, we might return to this sort of state of affairs where the government, and it doesn't matter who's in charge, who's in power, which particular party you think will be the worst or the best. If a politician, a bureaucrat gets this sort of power of very weak property rights, they can use it and exploit it against their political opponents, whoever they might be, whoever they decide they are. We always need to have these constitutional protections, no matter whether we think the people, the particular political party in charge is good or not. It's the concept and the principle itself of individual property rights, which we're undermining in South Africa, unfortunately. Just a few more things on the report itself, just so you get a better idea. But again, I advise you to go and read it for yourself. And so you can see maybe your own examples, how it applies to South Africa and where you think it could be useful and not. Economic freedom, it's not just this sort of abstract concept that we like to throw around. It has real world tangible effects. The more economic freedom a country has, the better off its people are. Just to give you some examples, our unemployment rate is the highest in recorded history. And of course, the country is witnessing dramatic human and capital flight. In terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, a clean environment, all of these things improve the freer a country is. So when you go in the opposite direction, these things deteriorate, they break down. We can see this in Venezuela and Zimbabwe, the two primary examples in our current age of countries which have gone in the very opposite direction, the direction of socialism, of state control, of collectivism. They're witnessing the results of throwing economic freedom out of the window. Economic freedom is not just for the top 1%, the top rich. It is for each and every individual to have the control and ability and the power within themselves to lift themselves up and to live in an environment and a society where their economic gains are protected and not always redistributed or seized or any of the above. Their wealth is for them to produce and use as they see fit. It is not for any politician or bureaucrat or ideologue to decide that their wealth should be spent on some sort of government project or government plan or any other grand social scheme. That's not what it ought to be about. That is unfortunately the case now, but I don't think that's what things should morally be about. They should be about individual rights and individual freedoms. One more thing on the EFW in terms of rankings and countries which do very well in the EFW almost every year. Hong Kong and Singapore are the top two countries, and then they're followed by New Zealand, Switzerland, the United States of America, Ireland, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Mauritius. So Mauritius, they're at least one African country in the top 10. They're doing a lot to try and attract investment, so credit to them for doing that, but unfortunately no other African countries in the top 10. Some African countries are trending upward, so that's good to see. I think their leaders are realizing excuse me, that they need to implement changes and implement changes fast. The longer you wait, the more difficult it is to bring about any sort of economic growth and economic recovery, because more and more investment leaves a country as it becomes less economically free. I think South Africa has it within its power to rise up the rankings once again, if only we would recognize that the solutions lie in individual freedom, individual liberty, things like free speech, property rights, and the rule of law. the idea that no one is above the law, that the law should be applied equally to everyone, politicians, and every man and woman on the street, no matter your class, income, background, all of the above. The law should be applied equally. And we're seeing a breakdown of all these sorts of ideas every single day, unfortunately. But I think that the tools are there for government to use if government is indeed serious about changing things around. I know it's radical, it's not savory for different organizations and bodies within the country. They are very much against any talk of economic freedom and individual liberty. But if they're serious about true economic transformation and economic growth, and letting South Africans, especially black South Africans, take control of their own lives, look after themselves and their own families, they're going to have to embrace the ideas of economic freedom and individual liberty. It's as simple as that. The links are clear for everyone to see if you look at the data. And indeed, if for example, you're someone who's in favor of massive welfare, state spending, people like to point to the Scandinavian countries as examples of where socialism has worked. Well, those countries only got there because their economies were free in the first place, and they could create wealth and build wealth, which they could then redistribute. So you can't redistribute wealth into being. Wealth needs to be created by individuals, by businesses, by people trading with each other. And the only way that they'll do that is if they're economically free to do so. And capital tends to go where it's most free to flow. And South Africa is unfortunately putting up more and more restrictions against both its own citizens and foreign citizens to prevent their capital from accumulating and growing in the country. And for as long as this trend continues, we'll continue to see the dire and downward economic trends that we've been seeing in the last few years. I'll end on that note. I want to thank you all once again for joining me. I hope you found something of use in this episode. Please do go and read the EFW report. I'll leave a link in the description below to the EFW, to this year's edition, and also to our media release about the EFW and the event we held here to launch this year's edition. I hope you all have a good week ahead, and I'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.